Hi, I'm Zac Childs, and welcome to the Truetone Lounge. Today, our guest is J.D. Simo. Welcome.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me, Zach.
Yeah. So you were born in Chicago.
I was
and
in '85.
In '85, and got bitten by the bug of music. So how did that happen?
What was Elvis and the movie The Blues Brothers when I was like 3-4 years old, and which we could talk a lot about in that regard, because like the Blues Brother movie, obviously the insane music that's in that thing, John Lee Hooker and basically Muddy Waters Band, Aretha Franklin, James Brown, but the band itself, Cropper and Dunn from Stax and Matt Murphy from Chess in Chicago, and then that great horn section, which essentially was the Saturday Night Live horn section,
Right.
was when you're that young, I mean, you just kind of, you play dress up, or you play with your, whatever, you do things that little kids do. And so like that movie was I was just obsessed with it. And it was a great introduction to some of the great American music that then from like going to the Chicago Public Library, which I lived right near. And I've always just been an insane researcher, just, much like you, because Zach actually is my oldest friend, folks. Like, we've known each other longer than, more than 10 years, probably closer to 13 or 14 years at this point. And Zach's, not only was he the best man at my wedding, but he's the reason I moved to Nashville. So anyway, so we both have a common love. Part of what bonded us early on is the researching element of things.
Yeah.
And so as a result of all that, I became exposed to lots and lots of other music just because of that movie. And then seeing Elvis on television was a huge thing, which led to, the first phase of my career, as it were. Because when I was a little kid, I'm just going to beat you because he knows all my secrets. So when I was a little kid, like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, I used to do like an Elvis thing. I used to do an Elvis show where I'd like do my hair up, which is not that different from the way it is now. But sideburns have remained all these years. But that was like the first performing I ever did, was doing Elvis songs like as Elvis, like a little Elvis thing with my guitar. And, the cool thing about that, in regards to exposure to those main things that made me fall in love with music, is, I couldn't have asked for a better portal into great music, because, that's kind of starting at a good central point, like whether you're talking about Elvis and like rock and roll, because, then of course getting into Elvis Presley, then you're exposed to Little Richard and Fats Domino and Chuck Berry and Bill Haley and the Comets and Gene Vincent and, all of the great rock music, the real rock and roll. And then like, a year or two later, when I was exposed to the Beatles, then it's like, it's just this perfect lineage where it all made more sense to me, because I kind of learned it in chronological order, which is strange,
Yeah.
Because I really didn't, contemporary influence, like, because there was great music happening when because I'm talking about like very late 80s and early 90s, there was really good music being made at that time, like Nirvana, like that whole movement, if you will, the grunge movement of the 90s. And then like as we were just talking off camera, like the kind of singer-songwriter, music from the 90s, like I didn't become as exposed to that till a little later, because I was so into older music. But that's what it was, that was the initial, love was very, was Black American music, soul music and roots music, blues music, because of that Blues Brother vein, which exposed me to a bunch, and then Elvis Presley,
Yeah.
So what's not to like, as we say.
What's not to like?
Yeah.
So you started, really getting into playing the guitar, and then your parents ended up moving to Phoenix.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, we relocated when I was, barely a teenager. And I, like when I was really young, I would get up and play at parties and stuff and do the Elvis thing, which also would include like Buddy Holly and, like, because I just loved 50s music as a kid. And so as I got a little older and became a little bit better of a guitarist, because I got my first guitar right before I turned 5 years old. And, but I took it really serious right from the get-go. I mean, I was really, really, still to this day, obsessive about when I am into something. I'm just tunnel visioned, and it's just, rereading books 20 times and listening to records 40 million times and all this kind of stuff. It's just, and you're like, again, like, Zach is like that too, so, and I think a lot of musicians are. I think that's kind of a normal, at least friends of mine that are in the music business. It's, they're music fans,
Yeah.
and the ones that aren't are jive, generally.
But I think, so many times people think that somebody was just, they were just born with this great talent. But the thing that they don't realize is that the really great players are obsessed with it.
Oh, yeah.
And so they go down the rabbit hole, and they do the research, they find the records, and then they spend the time, woodshedding it. And even if it's not playing something note for note, it's really absorbing the style and being able to take it and do something else with it.
Right, hopefully. But no, that's exactly right, And I mean, I think, as Zach would agree with me, the undisputed champion of guitarists, in our opinion, I think both would be Jack Pearson.
Yeah.
And, Jack is a very, very close friend of mine. And we many times will spend, the whole evening on the phone together, because we're both insomniacs kind of. So it's like, 2:00 in the morning till 5 in the morning phone calls are not uncommon for he and I to have with one another. But he'll be sitting there, we'll be talking on the phone, and he'll be sitting there practicing.
Yeah.
Which, it's like, I do think Jack is kind of touched by the hand of God, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
But, Jack, even now, like, I mean, it's, I get off the phone talking to him, and I'm like, I better go practice, because he takes it, that's even now,
Yeah.
And it's important, that immersion.
Yeah. Getting back to the timeline.
Yeah.
So you moved to Phoenix.
We moved to Phoenix.
Yeah. And you played, in some bands, and you by that time you were playing more, kind of blues rock.
Yeah.
And, after, touring the US for a while, you kind of decided that you wanted to move on to something else.
I did.
And
you were a part of that.
What happened from there?
Well, you and I had a very important phone call, actually. I know you weren't leading, you weren't baiting me, but the honest thing is, I knew that I had to move somewhere where something was going to potentially happen. And that, unfortunately, it's like, that's just not going to happen if you're not in like New York or Los Angeles or here in Nashville or maybe Austin, Texas. And I don't know, maybe Chicago, maybe, I don't know, which, where I'm from, but, maybe, but, really, and I realized that, But when you're young and you got no money and all that kind of stuff, it's not really what you want to hear.
Yeah.
Because it's hard, or it's hard if you don't live near one of those places.
Yeah.
If you're lucky enough to kind of live a couple 100 miles from one, maybe it's not as tough. But but yeah. So I realized that, and we had a very faithful conversation where you essentially were like, well, you're either going to do it or you're not, and if you're going to do it, you need to do it. And so that was one of the best bits of advice I was ever given. And so I moved here, and that was that.
But did you live happily ever after
Oh,
when
no,
you moved
no.
here?
No, not at all.
Why don't you tell a little bit about the struggles
Well,
that you faced? Yeah.
Well, you know what? Because I've told parts of the story, but because you and I are here, we might as well tell most of it, because it's actually, I think, more interesting in context. Because when I first moved here, I had a manager relatively quickly. I'm sure you'll remember.
Yeah.
And it was in my mind to kind of like, well, let me try and do a country artist thing.
Yeah.
Because essentially, like, I'd done all those years of playing in bars and playing cover music and playing, rock music, blues music, whatever. And I always like country music, the thing that you and I love, the kind of cosmic country stuff of the 60s and 70s, was a big influence on me and you. And so, quickly kind of like got to town. We made, and Zach played on this actually, that record that never came out and will never come out. It's buried in my yard somewhere, but not because of your input.
Yeah.
But we made a record relatively quickly, and that's how I met Dave Rowe. Because Dave Rowe, the bass player, played on that, which plays a part in the later part of the story. That's how I met Dave, and you played on it, and our good buddy Randall played on it from Brad Paisley's group. And we did it with Dave Ferguson, the famous engineer. And so right out of the gate, it was like meeting all these people that would have important, parts of my story later, right out of the gate. But we made this record, which wasn't that good because I was nowhere near ready to be an artist or make a record yet. I thought I was. I thought I was going to completely change this town, which is, I think you kind of need that kind of blind arrogance, I guess, to have the guts to kind of move to a place.
Absolutely.
But very quickly you understand how unspecial you are. Even if you are even special in a little bit, you learn relatively quickly when you go to a place that has a huge talent pool that's world class. You very quickly go, oh, okay, well, no, I'm way off mark here. So anyway, we made that record, tried to get a record deal, didn't get one, and but through that process met an individual who played another really important part in my life later. Paul Worley is a very famous producer in town, because Paul at the time was the head of A&R for Warner Brothers here, and he was very supportive right away. Didn't end up signing to Warner Brothers, thank God, actually, in the end, because that would have been a very different scenario in the end. But got Paul as a friend, so the thing we talked about before we started talking is, like, there's all these things that happen that you don't think that maybe at the time you're like, man, I want this to go the way I want it to go. And then it inevitably doesn't usually, but you meet these people that factor really important. And so it's like keeping on the path and being nice to everybody and not being a jerk really kind of helps in the long run, because it's all about relationships,
Absolutely.
So got through all that and ended up basically, completely broke and no record deal, nothing to show for it, and really nowhere to turn. And, the next chapter that happened was, essentially I was out of money and behind on rent and was about to get thrown out of this place I was renting over by the fairgrounds. And I called my parents for help, and they told me to go to hell, and which is actually the best thing they ever did for me as parents.
Right.
because had they bailed me out, like many parents probably would or do, this next thing wouldn't have happened to me.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was devastated because I literally was like, man, I'm going to be homeless. I don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, you know, I would have gotten a job or something, I guess. But the point, at the moment, it's like, oh my God, you know, what am I going to do?
Yeah. No one's going to bail me out.
No one, no.
Yeah.
And
that was a blessing.
yeah, it was. And so, you know, feeling sorry for myself, you know, people, I think, misconstrue this story as like, oh my gosh, you know, but it was me being dramatic, which I have a flair for at times. I'll admit, and just ask my wife. But you know, I had that at the time. All this was going on. I still have them, but I had these two rhinestone suits that Manuel graciously let me have. The famous rodeo tailor who like did Graham Parsons' suit and stuff. It was a really great story where, you know, he when I moved to town was one of those people I met, and you know, he knew that I was trying to get a record deal and all this stuff, and I was hanging out with him, going to his shop and hanging out with him back when his shop was on Broadway next to next to Nashville rather, which our town keeps changing, so that's just weird that's anyway. I would go and hang there, and he said to me once. I've never told this story. This is a good story. He was, I was hanging in there, and he knew that I had all these showcases coming up, you know. And he was like, "I hope you do well," you know. He's a very charismatic man, and I said, "Yeah, you know, I'd really like to have something, you know, a shirt or something." And he says, "You give me what you can give me, you know, and I'll take care of you, you know." And so. I'm not going to say how much I gave him, but it wasn't that much. I mean, at the time, it was all the money in the world to me, but it wasn't that much. And he made me two suits, like two full suits, a purple one and that maroon one. And man, I didn't have anything at that time. I literally had a trash bag of clothes, a blow-up bed, two guitars, and then an amplifier. And I had a television and my records and stuff like that. That was all I owned. And my car, my crappy car that I moved here with. But those suits, man, I'd hang those up and I'd look at those suits every night, and it was like that thing of like, it's going to work. It's in the end, it's going to work. Because why would I have these hanging there? This is amazing, you know. And so I'll always be really indebted to Manuel, because he was, you know, that meant a lot to me at that time, and still does. And I want to. The rest of it we'll save for another time, because there's some other stories about those suits, but whatever. I wore them all the time because I was proud of those darn suits. Yeah. Anyway, so I put one of those suits on. The reason I say that is because I put one of those suits on to go play on the street corner. Yeah. Because two things. One, I wore them all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I wore them I was in the grocery store in them sons of bitches. And it was, you know, and I didn't care if people looked at me weird. I was proud. I was wearing a Manuel suit. And also I figured I might make more tips if I wore them. So I put the cowboy suit on. And I went down to Broadway with my acoustic guitar, and I stood there and I played for, you know, a couple hours.
And again, this was because you had no money, and so you decided that you were going to go play for tips on Broadway in your full Manuel suit, and you had a Martin that you had bedazzled.
Right. Yes. I forgot about that. Yes, I had a Martin at the time. I took rhinestones and I like did the whole trim. Yes. And I did the pick guard, and I did, I think, the bridge and all this stuff. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And so you were playing, and somebody happened to walk along.
Yeah, Dave Rowe walked by, who had played on that record that I was trying to get a record deal with. So he knew me. Yeah. And Dave was like, "What the hell are you doing down here?" You know. Because at the time, and he may still be down there was this guy called Mandolin Mike who always used to play on the street corner right about where I was. And so anyway, I don't know, that just popped in my head. So there's people that would busk down there daily, as it were, you know, and might still do. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've been down there. But he walked by and said, "What the hell are you doing?" And, you know, this is the part of the story I have told a lot because it's important, and it was important to me, in that I had a decision to make. And the decision was, here's this musician who's a professional musician, played with Johnny Cash, Dwight Yoakam, somebody that I, as a newcomer to town, wanted to impress, wanted to think good of me, wanted, all these things that run through your mind. And so it's like, the choice was, do I play it off and be proud and be like, oh, Dave, I'm just kidding. I'm just, it's a joke or something like that. Or do I actually like tell him like why I'm there and be humble? And I was so distraught that the pride and proud side of me, like it just was, but I remember distinctly that kind of like bouncing ball for a moment. And then I just went, man, I'm screwed. I'm getting kicked out of my place. I got no money and I don't know what I'm going to do. And out of sympathy, I'm sure, just sympathy alone, Dave said, well, man, like, well, I'm walking on my gig with Don Kelly. Why don't you follow me in and I'll introduce you to Don? Because Guthrie's kind of, at the time, Guthrie Trapp was the guitarist, and Guthrie was kind of in and out, and was kind of on his way out of the band. And so, that this is again where the story can get really long, but essentially what ended up happening is, I ended up auditioning as a result of it, as a result of that initial meeting, and Dave essentially kind of working on Don for, I can't remember, it was maybe a week or two before Don finally relented and let me audition. But it was that initial, because that's the thing that I can't quite remember, because my wife, who I had just met, she remembers us going down there just after that. And like, you know what? No, it was like a week later that I finally did, because that was a whole nother situation. It's funny how memory plays tricks on you. But essentially, like once I met Don, I was on that, like, things I probably shouldn't say. It was because I saw it as an opportunity and a way out that could work, and it was all I had to go on. So I focused on it really, really hard, and then he let me come back and sit in, and then he started using me.
So what were you doing once you started focusing on getting the gig playing with Don Kelly? Did you start woodshedding?
Oh yeah, like you wouldn't believe. Yeah, harder than ever in my life, and since.
Yeah.
Because my life depended on it.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how that'll make you, whether you're an athlete, whether you're a writer, whether, whatever, it's whenever life depends on it. And so that's the thing where it's like, unless you're put in a position where your life depends on something, I don't think you'll ever get to the other side of something, because you have to be, I don't at all believe in the sentiment that like, art comes from pain. It can come from pain, but it definitely comes from discomfort. I don't think you can be comfortable and be artistic or make advancements in artistry. But that goes along with, life in general. I think that, the greatest, if a person truly grows and evolves, I think, it's through uncomfortable moments that many times can be painful. And that definitely was painful for me, but it was great because it forces you to get your shit together, which you need to. Most do.
So you started playing with Don.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you went from kind of being, artist, guy trying to get a deal. All of a sudden, you were 4 nights a week, 4 hours a night. You were on display, because it's kind of the Don Kelly gig is a guitar player gig, and it's all about playing long hot guitar solos 4 hours a night.
Yeah.
So
on and on and on.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing, amazing, amazing experience. I wouldn't trade that for anything, because it was where I learned, whatever I thought of myself as a musician, like writer, singer, all these other things are kind of over here, but like just focusing as a musician, that's what made me a musician, that thing. Because it's a pressure cooker. I'd never played that style of music really, because like what you and I were doing when like I was trying to be an artist was more along the lines of like what like Marty Stewart or Pete Anderson would do, which is still what I think is great and what I love. But what I mean by that is it's like simple. Yeah. Whereas with Don, it's that ridiculous, not only speed, but just navigation of a really, really difficult type of style to wrap your head around. And I had no time. I mean, I had no time to develop it. I developed it on stage, which is the notion that most people, I don't think they kind of, when I say that, they hear me, but they don't really they can't internalize that because I think it's such an abstract concept. But dude, any great, any heroes of mine that I really, really look up to, it's similar. Because that's where you learn. You learn in front of people, whether they're paying attention or not. Like that almost has nothing to do with it. It can just be two people. It can be a bartender and some drunk, but it's like it changes the molecular structure of what you're doing if there's people that are present when you're doing something. Yeah. And yeah, you do that thousands of times, which I did, with them, with that band in particular. I mean, I was there for nearly 6 years. And there was a lot of those weeks where I would play Sunday too, because I would, I never subbed out with that band. I was never sick. I played sick because I wanted to be there every time. Like I can count on one hand the times I missed in those 6 years, including then when Don would need me on Sunday and I'd be like, I'll be there. I'll see you, Yeah. So, I mean, that equates to, something ridiculous, like 1,200 or 1,300 gigs alone, not counting like all the sessions and all the other stuff too. I mean, but that's the common thing. It's the 10,000 hour thing. And there's no way around that. And not saying that, taking me out of the equation, that's the lasting sentiment that I think is important. Because everybody, no matter how old they are, but especially if they're young, nobody wants to believe, I certainly didn't want to believe that I'd have to work that hard. Mm-hmm. You want to think that you win the lottery, you sign that deal, that one person, changes your life and, all that kind of stuff. And in a way that does happen, but not in the way that you think or hope it will. Mm-hmm. It's a lot more subtle. And there's no way around the work. At least the people that I think are, and I don't mean to sound, I don't want to sound pompous or something about this, but it's like, to me, the ones that are truly making music, that are making a difference because they're truly able to emote and convey something that has meaning and depth, there's no way to get to that without the work, I think that you can get to a point where you can kind of approximate stuff, where you can kind of a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and the right clothes and the right gear and all this kind of stuff. Like you can kind of assimilate certain things, but it's like, when you're in the present, and again, I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about others that I perceive this. Like when I see someone that truly, usually when I'm seeing somebody play, or if I'm like looking at a bandstand of a band or something like that, like usually I'm drawn to like one person or two people or something like that. And like there's this thing that people call it or something, but it's like, and usually that has to do with what I'm talking about. It's like because they're expressing something that you can't get the easy way, you get it the hard way. And that, to me, the players that I look up to and have admired my whole life, and you as well, I know, that's the thing that I want. If I could be anything, I want to be like, and that's how you do it. You just do it.
So while you were working with Don Kelly, you also began to do some session work.
Yeah.
And so you kind of were getting established as a session guy.
Yeah.
And you were doing the Don Kelly thing.
Yeah.
And then, sometimes you hope for something, you get it, and you don't find fulfillment from it.
Yeah, which is another thing that, happens, and, especially when you're young. Yeah, no, I mean, I was with Don. I was very comfortable. I was making good money. And after about a year a year and a half, maybe, like, I finally kind of felt as comfortable as I ever felt. I never fully felt comfortable in Don's band, partially for kind of just the nature of the gig itself, but also because, I realized that, while I did get better at that particular style, it wasn't, I was approaching it from a different standpoint that couldn't by nature be authentic, because I didn't grow up cultivating that, and so it's like, in a way, it's like, people like Guthrie, people like Red Volkart, predecessors of mine, Brent Mason, predecessors of mine in that band, I never in my mind thought of myself in that genre in anywhere near any of those guys' leagues, because to me, they're the ones who do it right. And I just did it the way I did it, which, I got good at, but like, I never felt quite comfortable, like, and I still don't, like, I enjoy it and all that, but like, I never felt like I fully belonged, so bearing that in mind, it's, when the sessions started to come, it was, in a certain way, it was easy, because all of a sudden I wasn't having to be held to that kind of that kind of watermark, if you will, that every night I was with Don, and I don't mean that, and the reason why I'm saying that is because, like, the studio thing, it starts small. It starts with just demos and going to people's houses or whatever. And so it's like, I felt very low pressure, because what was being asked of me as a musician was much more utilitarian, much more basic, much more where it's like, oh gosh, I can actually breathe for a second. Yeah. So it's cool, because as I crept into the session thing slowly but surely, and then all of a sudden it happened, in a bigger way, where I was working all the time, I was conditioned for like this level of pressure. And so, like, I was cool with it, and I could deal with it, and I'd be like, yeah, I can do that. And, I felt very comfortable with it for a while. And then obviously, when you start playing on, when you start working with big producers, and when you start working on actual records, and you start, actually getting paid, what, a good master pays and stuff like that, your ego really likes it, so it's like, in the beginning I was like, yeah, like, it wasn't, I didn't view it as something that difficult. I felt comfortable relatively quickly, and I was like, well, this is cool, getting to work with all these players I always dreamed of working with. And I existed like that for quite a long time. It worked, and that's where Paul Worley comes back into the scenario, because Paul, I randomly ran into him at a music store, and I hadn't seen him since the days of trying to get the deal with Warner Brothers, and he had since left Warner Brothers, and kind of had this new wave with Lane Antebellum becoming hugely successful, and him producing all those records. And he was like, man, it's good to see you and all that. And then running into him and reconnecting, then all of a sudden he hires me to play on a record like a few weeks later.
Yeah.
And like, he was like the first big producer to start to use me, and he used me on some stuff, but just the word of that, like, got me all this other work and all this. So, and that's how it works, and it's just, again, like a chance, and he knew that I was playing with Don, and he didn't come down or anything, but he knew that, and he remembered that he liked my guitar playing, and that did that. So anyway, to bring it back, because I know that, to answer your question, I was really comfortable and happy for a long time, and I was making more money than I ever thought I'd ever make in the music business. But the for me, it wasn't so much of a, man, I want to be the guy, I want to be the artist or something like that. It really was much more fundamental than that, where it's like I found myself one day driving home from a 2 o'clock, well, because they do sessions at 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 6 o'clock, a union. And so my 2 o'clock had gotten done early. And so I had time to go home before I went to Roberts, because I always used to go to Roberts at like 5:30 in the afternoon, and which was perfect, because if I, if I was doing a 2 o'clock, which at that point I was doing a lot of, it was great, because I'd get done and I'd grab my gig bag and run right to Roberts, and I'd still be home, before 11 o'clock at night. And so anyway, this 2 o'clock session had ended early, and I was driving home to like hang out for an hour before I had to go to Roberts. And I was listening to talk radio in the car. And nothing against talk radio, because I love NPR and all that kind of stuff. But I was sitting at a red light, and I realized, like, it had been months and months. Like, I couldn't remember the last time I listened to music for pleasure.
Wow.
And I was 25 when this event occurred. And that was really weird for me, because I was like, well, I've got this, I'm living in a nice house, and, I wasn't married at the time, but I was living with who became my wife, with our dogs, and had this domestic life, and, all these grown up things that you want and you hope for. But music had become a job, and like the desire to look at it from a joyful perspective, from an enjoyment standpoint, was just like switched off, and had been for a while.
Wow.
And it scared the living daylights out of me, because first of all, I'm way too young for this to be this way. And I was. And I immediately realized that I had to do something about that. And I didn't know what, but I knew something had to change. So, the first step was, I became in love with vinyl again, which Zach and I mirrored each other in that, where I started collecting vinyl again, and started actually listening to records all the way through, like I had always done, but just, and then, I kind of, perspective is an interesting thing, because I started finding myself on a daily basis kind of realizing that I was really good within certain aspects of like the session business. I was really quick. I could read really well, and I could execute all the simple little basic things that if you can do them and the opportunities present themselves to you, you'll do well in the session world, But I just was looking at it every day and just going, if I don't do something now, I'll regret it, because I'm 25 years old and I'm still young. And also kind of recognize that if I was going to do something about it, it's going to take a hell of a lot of work. And if I didn't start soon, I'd never do it. And so it just started with, moving into, the formation of my group. It started out with just me taking songs I'd written, because, a lot of the session work that I was doing was like demos for publishing companies. So I met all these great writers, and I ended up writing with several of them over time. So it's like I was always writing, because I was always in the back of my mind going, well, that could be another avenue that I would do, because I'd always written songs. And so I was like, well, that could be something else that I do down the road, as well as being a session player or a sideman or something, because you think all these things, And so I had songs I'd written and all that, but I just started focusing on that. And there was two buddies of mine at the time, well, they're still good friends of mine, that I would work with a lot. One of them was my buddy Tim Marks, who is a very notable session bass player here in town, and still a really good buddy. And my other friend, John Radford, who's a marvelous drummer, who actually had an amazing band of his own called Llewellyn and the Sun a couple of years ago. So anyway, I just started going and hanging out with them just to jam, just to have fun. And that eventually kind of grew into the formulation of, because how people here in town, a lot of times, players, as it were, in quotations, I don't consider myself, there's real players. I was a third or quarter of that at best in my day. But, you go to Douglas Corner or go to Third and Lindsley or whatever, and you see these amazing kind of put together bands of sidemen that get together and have fun, because you need a release. If you're a sideman or a session player, you need to have some artistic release, And so I did some of those with Tim and John and my buddy Steve Henson, I remember, and a bunch of other guys were, but didn't really amount to much. And then I met my bandmates. I met, who I'm still in the group with, Adam Abershoff, the drummer, and the original bassist in the band, Frank Swart, who at the time he was playing with John Hyatt and Patty Griffin and all that. And they had an improvisational trio with Kenny Vaughan, who's another great guitarist here, called Funk Wrench. And I was a huge Funk Wrench fan. And I'd always wanted to play with Frank and Adam, but lacked the confidence, I guess, to ask them. So eventually Frank asked me, and then we got together and jammed, and immediately I was like, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do. And that was the formation of the group, and almost 6 years later, Adam and I still remain, and Elad Shapiro joined the group eventually, and the rest is a whole nother very long story. But that's how the group formed, and I just knew immediately. I knew immediately that this is what I was going to do, and that was scary.
Well, let's take a break there. Let's come back and let's talk more about Simo.
Sounds good.
So you were born in Chicago.
I was in 1941.
1941, the dirty streets of Chicago. And you came, playing acoustic blues, and then you switched to electric blues with Muddy Water. Okay.
Yeah, no. We'd go down to Pepper's, and we were all hanging out at the University of Illinois. And there was this guy, man, Butterfield was a bad dude, man.
Okay.
Sorry, anyway.
let's tell the real story.
Yeah, let's tell the real story.